After returning to Fortune Street and engaging in a brief fight with Song Chongjing, Bai Yuan didn't stay in the Li clan's residence for too long. He sprinted out of the small town and came to a momentary stop at where Chan Ping'an had entered the mountain. Bai Yuan then chose to retreat to where he had thrown the punch before, and he carefully examined the footprints that Chan Ping'an had left in the mud. Apart from Chan Ping'an's footprints, Bai Yuan also noticed the shallower footprints of an adult. He speculated that these footprints were most likely left by the young swordsman from Wind Lightning Field. When he had thrown a punch at Chan Ping'an, that young man had clearly wanted to seize the opportunity to attack him, with his sword intent leaking for a split second. However, he had immediately suppressed it, and most people wouldn't have noticed anything untoward. However, Bai Yuan had experienced countless battles, and he had also cultivated for 1,000 years in Sun-Scorched Mountain, which possessed a sweeping sword chi that can cut through the treasured vial. Thus, he was far too familiar with sword intent and sword chi. Bai Yuan had lived for a long time, so he had naturally seen and experienced many things as well. He had seen sword immortals who were skilled in nurturing top-notch flying swords, and there were those who possessed dozens of mini flying swords that could fit in their sleeves. These were flying swords that were as small and fine as hair. He had also seen a bonded flying sword that was as large as a mountain, with its power so immense that it could sever a river with a single slash. Bai Yuan stopped and contemplated for a while before deciding to continue forward. The foot of the mountain was filled with overgrown grass, and after a while, he was greeted by the sight of a bamboo forest. The ground was filled with withered leaves from last autumn and winter. However, because this closest bamboo forest was the closest to the small town, it didn't appear too desolate or disorderly. Following the vaguely perceptible footprints, the old ape discovered that he was soon going to exit the bamboo forest. However, Bai Yuan chose not to directly exit the bamboo forest, and he instead observed his surroundings. He found that there were no more footsteps from the young boy. He looked up at the stalks of green bamboo, and he found that there were no marks on these either. Even so, Bai Yuan still refused to directly climb the mountain to give chase. Instead, he leaped up and landed on the tip of a thick bamboo stalk with a single foot, slightly exerting some force and causing his body to lean forward. The bamboo bowed, and just as it was about to snap, Bai Yuan suddenly retracted his aura and caused his body to become as light as a feather. With no more weight on it, the bamboo instantly shot back upright. Like an immortal soaring through the wind, Bai Yuan stood on the tip of the bamboo stalk and gently swayed with it, observing the surroundings as he did so. He looked down and he finally discovered a small clue. The corners of his mouth curled up, and he turned to his left and peered into the distance. Pricking up his ears, he could hear the faint sound of flowing water in the distance. Bai Yuan smiled coldly and said, "As cunning as always." Using the stalks of green bamboo as footholds, Bai Yuan sprinted toward the small creek to his left, leaving a trail of snapped bamboo stalks in his wake. He stopped again after arriving at the creek, unsure of whether Chan Ping'an had traversed deeper into the mountain forests or whether he had fled downstream. His brows were knitted in a deep frown, and there was a slight hint of anger on his face. If this were a mountain with some spiritual energy in the outside world, Bai Yuan could have made a grabbing motion with his hand and easily forced the god of the land to show himself and accept his orders. A simple question, and he would have been able to learn Chan Ping'an's whereabouts. This was also one of Bai Yuan's innate mystical abilities. Otherwise, regardless of how powerful or mighty a cultivator was, they definitely wouldn't have the ability to order the local god of the land or god of water around. This was quite similar to the empires and imperial courts of the mortal world, where it was extremely difficult for the Minister of War to command a measly external official from the Ministry of Revenue. Most importantly, the Minister of War and the external official from the Ministry of Revenue weren't even from the same imperial court. Bai Yuan fell deep into thought as he listened to the sound of the flowing water. Thinking from a logical perspective, Chan Ping'an had most likely developed his skills and stamina by climbing the mountains and swimming through the creeks from a young age. Perhaps he had even experimented with elementary breathing techniques before, and maybe it was because of this that he possessed such an exceptional physique, with his body light and his bones sturdy. This then allowed him to play the cat and mouse game with Bai Yuan on the rooftops. If this were the case, it made sense for Chan Ping'an to venture deeper into the dense forests to find a hiding spot. If he were nothing more than an ordinary young boy, however, then he had most likely been acting on an impulse to seek revenge before. After witnessing Bai Yuan's strength and calming down a little, it would only be natural for him to feel a sense of lingering fear. As such, it would be no surprise if he ran to the blacksmith shop in the south to seek protection from Master Ruan. If Chen Ping'an had chosen the former option, this would only waste some of his time. If Chen Ping'an had chosen the latter option, however, this would waste not only his strength and energy, but it might even use up some of Sun-Scorched Mountain's goodwill. Bai Yuan uttered his sincere thoughts at this moment, saying, Chen Ping'an must die. He didn't hesitate any longer, and chose to venture downstream to look for Chen Ping'an. There was a winding mud road to the south of the small town, and both sides of it were decorated with the rice paddies and croplands of the town residents. Halfway up the winding road, there was a rundown temple with white walls and black roof tiles. It was called a temple, but in reality, it was nothing more than a resting spot for the residents. This was especially the case when the weather became scorching hot or when the heavens unleashed torrential rain upon them. During these times, it would make a huge difference whether there was a resting spot or not. Right now, Chen Ping'an and Ning Yao were resting and discussing their plans here. Ning Yao was born a sword prodigy, and she could easily see things even in the dark. This allowed her to quickly discover the childish graffiti on the broken walls of the temple. Written using charcoal crayons, most of the graffiti was the names of people. The characters near the bottom of the wall had already become smudged and unclear, and perhaps they had been rubbed off or written over by others. Only the characters higher up were still clear and intact, and she could easily make out the names of several people: Songji Sin Ji Gui, Zhao Yao Xiashi, Chao Shi, and so on. Perhaps they had sat or even stood on the shoulders of their friends to write their names up so high. In fact, Ning Yao even saw Lu Xianying, Chen Ping'an, and Gu Can's names written on the uppermost left corner of the wall. Their names appeared slightly distant and disjointed from the rest of the names. Ning Yao retracted her gaze and said, "No matter what, we've successfully completed the first stage of our plan. We forced that old ape to replenish his qi once. Anyway, are you really planning to return to the small town to retrieve your wooden bow? Won't that be too risky? What if the old ape is extremely cautious and didn't go up the mountain to look for you? Won't you be running straight into his maw?" Chen Ping'an was quietly practicing his breathing technique, with the length of each inhalation and exhalation varying depending on his feeling. What he sought was the most comfortable state. Hearing Ning Yao's question, he replied with a resolute expression, "I have no choice. I have to retrieve my wooden bow. Otherwise, we would have wasted all our previous effort. Moreover, just like you said, shooting him is useless unless I can hit him in the eye. I shot him from close range in Clay Vase Alley, but the damage it caused was negligible." Ning Yao was slightly irritated and she said, "I already told you. Your trifling skills are useless against him. You didn't believe me before, and you stubbornly insisted on doing things your way. So I said fine and I let you do things your way. Since you believe me now, it's time to follow my plans, right?" Regarding how to deal with Bai Yuan, Chen Ping'an and Ning Yao had initially decided to each do their own thing during their discussion on the covered bridge. Chen Ping'an had simply told Ning Yao to wait for him to talk to 3 people first. However, he had suddenly changed his mind, and he had caught up to Ning Yao just as she reached the steps on the northern end of the covered bridge. Afterward, the two of them had a huge disagreement. Since Chen Ping'an wasn't a cultivator and couldn't even practice a simple fist technique, Ning Yao insisted that he stay out of it and simply observe things from the sidelines. If he wanted to, he could clap and cheer her on as she killed the old ape and exacted revenge for Lu Xianying. However, when Chen Ping'an had asked her about the details, Ning Yao had refused to elaborate on how she would kill Bai Yuan. She simply said that she had a powerful trump card. Otherwise, without some trump cards, how could she go on an adventure through the world? Hearing this, Chen Ping'an had rejected her proposal. Afterward, he had gone to look for the 3 people. Chen Ping'an stood up and stretched his back, with his movements barely inhibited anymore. "Alright, that should be enough rest." Ning Yao was astonished and she said, "The medicine from the Yang family's medicine shop, is that effective?" A hint of despondence flashed through Chen Ping'an's eyes. However, he quickly nodded and said with a smile, "Yes, it's very effective. Will the old ape see through your escape plan?" Ning Yao asked. Chen Ping'an pondered for a moment before cautiously replying, "Possibly. Ning Yao used the scabbard of her saber to draw 2 circles and a line in the dirt before asking, "This is the path between this temple and the Li clan's residence on Fortune Street. Where is your wooden bow hidden?" Chen Ping'an squatted down and drew a circle saying, "It's near the east around here. It's not too far from Clay Vase Alley." Ning Yao nodded and said, "All right then. Even if that old ape directly comes here, I'll engage with him and try to buy enough time for you." Chen Ping'an drew another small circle in the middle of the line and he said, "Ning Yao, if the worst-case scenario really does play out, can you lead him to this place? This is where I entered the mountain before. If you guys are there, then it won't take me too long to head over after I retrieve my wooden bow." The young girl in green leaned on her saber and said in a proud voice, "Perhaps I'll be waiting for you with the old ape's head in my hand at that time." Chen Ping'an shook his head and said, "Don't try to show off. You need to be careful." Ning Yao genuinely wanted to wrap his head with the scabbard of her saber. Just who was trying to show off? She glared at him and exclaimed, "The person standing in front of you is Ning Yao. Someone who's going to become the #1 sword immortal in the world in the future. Understood?" Chen Ping'an stood up before glancing down to check the 2 pouches of coins on his waist. As a precaution, he tightened them again. He then looked up and said, Yes, I understand. So you definitely can't die in a small place like this, right? Otherwise, just how unfortunate would that be? As your friend, when you become a powerful and mighty sword immortal in the future, I'll also be able to bask in your glory." Ning Yao sighed with emotion and said, "Chen Ping'an, you're as fussy as an old woman and you're also so hesitant and indecisive. I suggest that you don't look for a wife in the future. Just marry some random girl and call it a day." Chen Ping'an didn't retort her, and he simply replied with a chuckle. Just as he was about to leave the temple, Ning Yao said, "I'll go with you to the creek first. After that, I'll head northwest to avoid having that old ape become worried about the little girl. Otherwise, what will we do if he doesn't find you after leaving the bamboo forest and therefore decides to give up and return to the small town?" Chen Ping'an thought about this for a moment, and he didn't reject Ning Yao's proposal. They ran toward the creek. Ning Yao's breathing was like the flowing water of a magnificent river with incredible depth and surging undercurrents, while Chen Ping'an's breathing was like the flowing water of a creek that was long and steady. Their auras were vastly different. Ning Yao suddenly couldn't contain her urge and she asked, "Will the herbal medicine you want to apply to the arrowhead really be effective?" "Well, it's effective against wild boars that weigh over 100 kilograms, so I assume that it should be effective against that old ape as well," Chen Ping'an replied. Ning Yao didn't say anything else. When they arrived in front of the creek, this was the location where Chen Ping'an had come on shore before. They both bent their knees and leaped up at almost the exact same instant, flying through the air and landing on the opposite side. Ning Yao slowed down and grabbed her scabbard after landing. Meanwhile, after sprinting and leaping over the creek, Chen Ping'an continued to dash forward in a continuous motion, instantly overtaking the young girl. Just as he was about to turn around, Ning Yao said, "Don't worry about me. You return to the small town first." As Chen Ping'an continued to forge ahead, he glanced back and said, "I'm going to take a detour and find a quieter alley to enter the small town, so I might return a bit later." Ning Yao nodded in understanding. When Chen Ping'an disappeared into the distance, she let go of her sword hilt and started to walk slowly toward the west. After a short while, she came to a stop and peered into the distance at the upper reaches of the creek. A tall and burly figure suddenly leaped off a large rock in the creek and shot toward its northern banks, landing 20 or so steps away from the young girl. His aura was intense and domineering. However, Bai Yuan was slightly puzzled, as he couldn't sense Chen Ping'an's aura in the surroundings. He unconsciously glanced at the sword by Ning Yao's waist, and he said with a smile, "Young girl, you were the person who caused a ruckus in Fortune Street a short while ago, correct?" Ning Yao remained silent as she rested her hands on her sword hilt and saber hilt. Bai Yuan wore a curious expression as he said, "Young girl, even though you hid your identity the entire time while we were coming to the small town, I can tell that your background isn't simple. You're definitely not like the trash from Light Breeze City and Old Dragon City. However, what puzzles me is why you're targeting me like this, even though there's no grievance or grudge between us. Or perhaps someone from your clan or sect has grudges against Sunscorch Mountain." Ning Yao didn't say a word as she unsheathed her sword and saber in unison, leaping forward in a flash. The slender saber arrived first, slashing down at Bai Yuan's head. Bai Yuan casually raised an arm to forcefully deflect the blow. Ning Yao used this momentum to spin around, slashing her sword at the old ape's neck as she did so. Bai Yuan once again used his arm to forcefully block this strike. After failing to take Bai Yuan down with her 2 strikes, Ning Yao didn't choose to further engage in close-quarter combat. Instead, she created some distance between them before slowly pacing around. After using his incredibly powerful physique to gauge the sharpness of Ning Yao's weapons, Bai Yuan ignored the bloody gashes on his forearm and said with a smile, "Your weapons are fairly impressive. Moreover, you dare to carry 2 of them around with you, so it's quite clear that you're the disciple of an impressive sect from the mountains. Otherwise, you're the direct disciple of a first-rate power outside the mountains. In fact, I almost thought you were another swordsman from Wind Lightning Field, one who was lying low." Tracking the pacing young girl with his gaze, Bai Yuan said in a solemn voice, "Young girl, I know that you won't give up even if you fail in a moment. So I'll give you one last chance to reveal your identity and background before I kill you. However, Sun-Scorched Mountain won't apologize because of this matter, nor will it care where you're from and what your identity is." Ning Yao completely ignored his remarks. From the beginning to the end, she was observing him and looking for his weak points. After all, she wasn't Song Changjing, someone who had already discovered the path to the 10th tier. She couldn't face this mountain-moving ape head-on. Feeling like he had already conceded too much ground, Bai Yuan chuckled coldly and said, "Since you're unwilling to accept my kindness, then so be it." Bai Yuan arrived before Ning Yao in a single stride, raising his arm and forming a fist before hammering down at her head. Ning Yao raised her saber to block this attack, with the blade of her saber facing Bai Yuan's wrist. At the same time, she viciously thrust her sword at his chest, with the tip of the sword pointing at his heart. Surprisingly, however, Bai Yuan's fist opened up into a palm, and he nimbly grabbed the blade of her saber. Meanwhile, his other hand instinctively shot over to grab the tip of her sword. It was clear that his attack had only been a facade, with his true intention being to invite a careless attack from Ning Yao. As someone from Sun-Scorched Mountain, a holy land for swordsmen in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, Bai Yuan was naturally able to tell that this sword was extraordinary with a single glance. In order to grab it, he had even been willing to replenish his chi for a second time. In fact, the tip of the sword had already pierced through his chest, and it was only an inch or so away from penetrating his heart. Seeing that she was in a precarious situation, Ning Yao resolutely let go of her sword. At the same time, she forcefully tugged at her saber, causing it to slide through Bai Yuan's grip and emit a piercing scraping sound, like that of metal against rock. After freeing her saber, Ning Yao quickly leaped back and retreated. Sure enough, the old ape turned around and flicked his wrist, causing the sword to fly dozens of meters away. He then launched a kick at the young girl. Ning Yao raised her right hand, which was now empty, and with a thump, she was struck by Bai Yuan's kick and sent flying 20 meters into the distance. She landed heavily on her back, and only after taking a few tumbles did she finally manage to dig her saber into the ground and halt her momentum. Thankfully, the earth near the banks of the creek was relatively soft and loose, and the rocks on the ground were also round and smooth instead of jagged and sharp. It was because of this that her back didn't become a bloody and mangled mess. Bai Yuan didn't give her any time to rest, with his large body soaring forward and slamming down from the sky. Ning Yao didn't even have time to retrieve her saber from the ground as she retreated again and again. Bai Yuan didn't continue to pursue her, and after landing, he raised a foot and stomped on the hilt of her saber. When the young girl who was down on one knee looked up, Bai Yuan increased the force underfoot and sent the saber deep into the earth, with its hilt drawing level with the ground. A golden-purple aura fluctuated near the old ape's face, and it appeared especially dazzling when juxtaposed against the darkness of the night sky. He sneered and said, "You practice the sword, yet you also practice the saber, causing your techniques to become disorderly and unrefined. It's inevitable that you're in such a miserable situation." Ning Yao stood up and forcefully stopped herself from vomiting a mouthful of blood before saying, "Is that all you've got?" Bai Yuan shook his head and said with a smile, "I was only giving you one last chance." Ning Yao took a deep breath before saying in a solemn voice, "In my hometown, we don't care about who someone's parents are when we fight against them. If someone has the ability to kill you fair and square, then you can only blame yourself for being too weak and inferior. If my parents learn of this in the future, they'll at most only come to Eastern Treasured Vile Continent to target you. They definitely won't target Sun-Scorched Mountain. So you can be at ease and fight me with your full strength. This was the first time Bai Yuan had seen her being so talkative, and she appeared completely different from the young girl with a veiled hat who was reserved and didn't show many emotions. Bai Yuan suddenly felt a cold chill at the back of his neck at this instant, and this caused him to immediately turn his head to the side. A blade scraped past his neck, leaving a shallow wound. If he hadn't turned his head, the sword would have severely wounded him even if it couldn't directly run through his neck. At that time the tables would turn on him, and he would eventually fall to a bigger and bigger disadvantage. Moreover, if he revealed his true form too early, he would lose his moral high ground and thus lose his bargaining chip against Qi Jingchun and Master Ruan. Perhaps this would even affect his young mistress and lead her to face all kinds of danger by herself. With this in mind, Bai Yuan finally became enraged for a third time. The flying sword didn't return to its sheath, and it instead flew around Ning Yao as if it were trying to ask for praise and also please her. Bai Yuan laughed in anger upon seeing this and he said, "Very well, I wasn't able to fight to my heart's content with Song Chongjing just then, so I guess I'll play around with you for a little while. However, just how many heavy strikes can your fragile body withstand?" Ning Yao frowned slightly as she observed the golden-purple aura around Bai Yuan's face. Even though he had already used his mystical abilities 3 times, it was clear that he still had some remaining strength. At the very least, his acupoints hadn't collapsed and forced him to reveal his true form. Moreover, having one's lifespan shortened would be a huge blow to those below the upper 5 tiers, but it would be much less of a blow to this mountain-moving ape, even though it would still be painful. Ning Yao moved her fingers slightly, causing her sword to spin in an agile manner. She smiled and said, "No wonder my father said that Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's Sun-Scorched Mountain isn't worth a mention. The cultivators there talk big but have little skills to back up their boasts. You people have blind courage, but you're unfortunately stupid and have extremely shallow sword chi." Bai Yuan flared up in rage and he bellowed, "You're seeking death." He charged at the impudent young girl. Ning Yao didn't zealously continue to fight, and she instead retreated toward the north. Her situation remained precarious, and if it wasn't for her flying sword receiving 2 characters from the plaque Unmatched Aura, allowing it to grow explosively in sword chi and spirit, she would have faced many more life-threatening situations. Now, however, the flying sword was linked to Ning Yao's mind, and this allowed her to control it with her thoughts. It was because of this that she was able to block many of the old ape's vicious attacks. If this were a bonded weapon that she had spent a huge amount of effort to nurture, Bai Yuan wouldn't have been astonished at all. However, he knew very clearly that this definitely wasn't the strange young girl's bonded sword. She seemed more like an ordinary martial artist who was traveling through the world with a convenient weapon in her hand. All that she cared about was the sharpness of her blade. She didn't care about nurturing her sword heart, nor did she care about nurturing a sword spirit. However, what was strange about her was that she wasn't fully walking the path of a martial artist either. This was because martial artists who focused on tempering their physiques yearned to reach a state of remaining indestructible, even as heaven and earth shattered. If their weapons took over and gained the ability to act on their own, they would be regarded as disreputable martial artists from heretical sects. After chasing Ning Yao for so long, Bai Yuan was unable to capture her partly because of the flying sword, and partly because she had practiced so many different arts. She practiced sword arts, martial arts, and also cultivation. Bai Yuan racked his brains, but he truly couldn't think of a sect in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent that could raise such a strange disciple. Thus, he became increasingly careful with his attacks, as he attempted to ascertain her identity and background. In any case, everything would be fine as long as they didn't get too close to the small town. Regardless of how messy things were there, Bai Yuan wouldn't face any dangers in this place. Ning Yao became increasingly pale as she continued to flee. "You're a spent force," Bai Yuan said with a wicked smile. "To say nothing of whether you can flee back to the small town, even if you can, and there's someone there to help you, do you really think that I can't kill you?" Bai Yuan stamped his feet and leaped up, ignoring the flying sword and directly jumping over Ning Yao's head, landing in front of her and blocking her path. He then swung his fist and sent the flying sword spinning hundreds of meters into the distance. However, the irritating flying sword instantly soared back again and stabbed at his head. When Bai Yuan tried to grab the flying sword and hold it still, it slyly retreated from his reach as if it could read his mind. Coming and going like the wind, the flying sword was extremely unpredictable and hard to defend against. Even though Bai Yuan wasn't afraid of being wounded thanks to his strong physique, he was still left in a slightly disheveled state thanks to the flying sword. Ning Yao wasn't willing to face Bai Yuan head-on, so she changed her direction and started to run toward the northeast. Bai Yuan changed directions along with her, threatening her no matter where she went. He swatted aside the flying sword that was speeding toward him as if he were swatting a fly, causing it to pierce almost a meter into the ground. Like a young girl swaying her hips, the flying sword swayed back and forth as it pulled itself from the ground with much difficulty. Hovering in the air, its tip shuddered violently as if it were a furious little kitten. After pausing for a brief moment, it viciously stabbed at the old ape again. Bai Yuan was incredibly annoyed and he couldn't help but say, "Why is this flying sword allowed to ignore the rules of this place? Tell me, what's your relationship with Qi Jingchun or Ruan Qiong?" Ning Yao was almost struck in the forehead by the old ape. As she leaned back, she reached out to grab the hilt of her flying sword, which forcefully dragged her back and out of the range of Bai Yuan's attacks. After retreating some distance, Ning Yao decided against retreating all the way to the small town for some reason. Instead, she stopped and stood still, cocking her head and spitting out a mouthful of blood. The flying sword rang continuously as it hovered beside the young girl, and it was as if it were a young and puzzled student who was rattling away to his elders and asking a million questions. Ning Yao placed her right hand on her left shoulder. Bai Yuan suddenly slowed down, laughing heartily and saying, "Just as I expected, this flying sword recognizes you as its owner, and it can indeed act against the rules of this place. However, it's only a flying sword after all, and even if it has its own spirit, it can only do so much without your commands. However, it's a shame that both your body and your soul were severely wounded in the small town, and you're still yet to recover from these injuries. As such, you're completely unable to command your flying sword. It's because of this that your attacks have been random and disjointed. It's also why you're allowing your flying sword to attack by itself. In any case, you were never genuinely trying to wound me in the first place. However, when it comes to life-saving defensive techniques, you have no option but to control the flying sword with your mind." Ning Yao finally spoke again, saying, "You speak so much." Her lips were sanguine red, and her face was as pale as a sheet. Standing before the backdrop of the night sky, the young girl in green looked much like a female ghost who was wandering around the wilderness of the small town. Bai Yuan strode forward, clicking his tongue in wonder as he said, "You have a powerful flying sword, but it's a shame that your body is too weak to fully control it. You're just like a tree with powerful branches but a weak trunk. How pitiful. You and that young boy from the alley racked your brains to come up with ways to force me to replenish my qi, such that I'll invite retribution from this heaven and earth. Young girl, why don't you take a guess? After I exhaust this third breath of qi and replenish my qi for a fourth time, will I invite the wrath of heaven and earth? And will I be able to endure that wrath?" An amused smile suddenly spread across Ning Yao's face as she lightly tapped her feet and jumped back. She only jumped up less than 3 meters, and she only jumped back less than 2 meters. Bai Yuan, who was just about to attack her, couldn't help but find this odd. Afraid that there was a trap, he continued to advance in a slow and cautious manner, keeping his eyes peeled for any sudden changes. While she was in midair, Ning Yao lightly tapped her feet again, this time exerting a little more power and also twisting her toes, causing her to jump to the side instead of straight back. As it turned out, the flying sword had already flown beneath her feet while she was still in midair, allowing her to use it as a platform and continue to jump higher and also further back. Even Bai Yuan, who had seen many things and experienced many battles, faltered upon seeing this. This was a strange and slightly farcical sight. Like a small Milu playing hopscotch, Ning Yao continued to hop around in a graceful and lively manner. It wasn't long before she vanished in the night sky. Moreover, perhaps afraid that the old ape would suddenly attack her, Ning Yao's movements appeared extremely random and unpredictable, sometimes jumping to the left, and sometimes jumping to the right, sometimes jumping higher, and sometimes jumping lower, sometimes jumping forward, and sometimes jumping back. Bai Yuan pursed his lips, his expression extremely complicated as he said, "Just like a bounding antelope." However, he didn't stand still as he watched her flee. With a flick of his foot, he casually kicked up a stone and caught it in his palm. With a swing, he then ferociously launched the stone into the air. One after another, Bai Yuan continued to flick stones into his hands before viciously throwing them at Ningyao. Even though most of the stones missed, there were still 7 or 8 that greatly threatened Ningyao, forcing her to control her sword to shatter them. Like the rumbling thunder of spring, explosions intermittently reverberated through the air. Bai Yuan's expression became dark. This young girl had either gone crazy or she was absolutely stupid. She was clearly able to fly beyond the range of his stones, yet she insisted on maintaining the same height. She was like a lightly armored cavalry pacing back and forth along the edges of the battlefield, tempting the enemy archers to continuously waste their arrows and strength on her. Before he knew it, they had already arrived near the west side of the small town. Bai Yuan roughly estimated how much chi he had remaining. It wasn't much. He then picked out 2 egg-sized stones, one in each hand, before striding forward and swinging an arm, his muscles bulging as he did so. This was an astonishing sight, and the stone surprisingly crackled as it soared through the air, leaving a trail of sparks behind it. This was extremely peculiar, and it was as if it were a slender fire dragon that was soaring into the sky. "Get down here!" Bai Yuan roared. A brilliant spark exploded in the air before a low rumble traveled over. Ningyao groaned as she plummeted toward the ground, flying erratically like a drunkard. The flying sword whimpered in grief as it tried its best to help its owner. Bai Yuan didn't spare the young girl and flying sword so much as a glance, and he instead squinted his eyes as he peered at the rooftops to the west of the small town. When a streak of black flashed past, he forcefully stomped his feet and released the remaining stone, chortling with laughter and saying, "Trying to save her? You die first." Ningyao vomited blood and screamed, "Don't come over." The heavily wounded young girl couldn't bring herself to look over. At this moment she felt a slight sense of despair. She held onto her sword with much difficulty, and when one arm became too tired, she would hurriedly switch to the other arm. She did this again and again, slowing herself down as she fell to the ground. Ningyao never imagined that it would be her clever act that would kill Chan Ping'an, the young boy in straw sandals who had a bamboo basket on his back and a fish basket by his waist. The young boy who walked as briskly as the wind as he hurried about every day, busily earning money and busily brewing medicine. To die just like this, Ningyao felt like this wasn't right. After shakily landing on the ground, she put her index finger and middle finger together to form a sword. She then placed her fingers on her glabella and said through gritted teeth, "Come out. Shatter this heaven and earth." A thin golden line materialized on her glabella, slowly growing and expanding downward. This was just like an immortal opening their heavenly eye. Under the ancient stone archbridge, the covered bridge of today, a rusty blade whose tip had been pointing toward the deep pool for thousands of years suddenly yawned like someone who had just woken up from a deep slumber. The rusty blade shuddered slightly. The covered bridge shuddered along with it. The entire creek also shuddered. The entire small world also shuddered. Deep in a mountain, a travel-worn Qi Jingchun was walking with several other people. As he peacefully walked through the mountain, he suddenly raised a foot and was just about to forcefully stomp down. However, he suddenly smiled and gently lowered his foot. Sitting next to an oil lamp in the Yang family's medicine shop, Old Man Yang was suddenly roused from his nap. He tapped the table with his tobacco pipe. Standing in his official residence, Song Chongjing suddenly started to stamp his feet and curse. In a blacksmith shop by the creek, Ruan Qiong surprisingly missed the sword billet as swung down with his hammer, causing an expression of shock to spread across the face of the young girl who was holding the sword billet for him. Lying on a rooftop and gazing at the night sky, Ma Kuxuan, who was treated as a retard by everyone, suddenly sat up straight, with killing intent bursting from his body. Right at this moment, a familiar and extremely worried voice suddenly rang out, drawing closer and closer to Ningyao. "Ningyao, why are you stupidly standing there? Run! I'm not dead. That was just a shirt that I took off. That old beast is stupid, but why have you gone stupid as well?" Ningyao's mind was already fuzzy at this moment. With the edict ceremony almost reaching completion, However, she suddenly felt like she was taken on a ride through the clouds and mists, as someone tossed her onto their shoulder and ran toward the alleyway. Ningyao suddenly came to her senses, with her body bouncing up and down with the movement of Chen Ping'an's shoulder. She felt slightly uncomfortable, and she felt even more embarrassed. She was completely stupefied as she murmured, "Huh." Chen Ping'an sprinted away with Ningyao on his shoulder, his speed even quicker than when he had climbed the mountain just then. It was as if he were kidnapping someone's pure and chaste daughter. Ningyao's wounds were quite severe, and she felt even worse as she bounced up and down on Chen Ping'an's shoulder. However, this was no time to worry about her feelings or face. Otherwise, if the old ape struck them again, it was extremely likely that she and Chen Ping'an would die together for the sake of love. Ningyao's forehead was dripping with sweat as she asked, "How did you survive? You weren't hit by the stone? How did you know that the old ape would target you and not me?" After asking all these questions, Ningyao suddenly came to her senses and said, "Forget about this first. While the old ape is replenishing his qi, we need to run as far away as we can. I've already commanded my flying sword to obstruct him, but I predict that it can't delay him for too long." Chen Ping'an nodded gently, and he was as quick as the wind as he adeptly navigated the alleys. He was like a fish speeding through the water. After running far away from the west side of the small town, Chen Ping'an found the opportunity to quietly explain, "While we were fighting in Clay Vase Alley, I tricked the old ape to jump on top of an old and run-down roof, causing him to fall into the house. While he was down there, I secretly tossed a small piece of broken tile onto the nearby roof. Sure enough, he thought that it was me being careless and revealing my position, so he suddenly tossed a tile over, breaking both the wall and the roof. That was truly terrifying. Just then, I was actually lying on a nearby rooftop for quite a while, but I didn't dare to come out because I was afraid that I would distract you. I was also thinking about whether I could shoot the old ape with an arrow. However, when I saw him throw that stone into the air, how could I still dare to be careless? It was like a fire dragon soaring to the sky, and I'm pretty sure that everyone in the small town could have seen it if they looked up. I thought a step further at that moment, and I considered what I would do if I were him. I would definitely use you as bait to lure out the person who was hiding nearby. After dealing with them, I would turn my attention back to you. To catch two fish with one bait, just how good would that be, right? So I decided to take off Lu Xinying's shirt and throw it out first. Only after that did I dare to dash out to rescue you." Ningyao's eyes lit up, and she clicked her tongue in wonder. However, she mysteriously started to interrogate him, asking, "Chen Ping'an, who did you learn all these slimy schemes from? You look honest and sanctimonious, but you're definitely not as honest as you appear. Speak. After Taoist Lu saved me and brought me to your house, did you take that opportunity to do anything else to me after removing my veiled hat?" Chen Ping'an was dazed, and his expression was just like when he had been whipped in the head by cowtails when he was young. "What?" Ningyao didn't continue her interrogation, and she instead started to chuckle to herself. Chen Ping'an was an avaricious person, but he was definitely not a pervert. Ningyao firmly believed this, just like how she firmly believed that she would definitely become a mighty sword immortal in the future. Not one of the most powerful, but the most powerful. "Put me down," she said in a low voice. "You can walk by yourself now?" Chen Ping'an asked. "Not yet," Ningyao replied begrudgingly. "But if you continue to run like this, even my heart and intestines are going to be shaken out by you. At that time, I might not be killed by the old ape's fist, but I'll instead be killed on your shoulder. The old ape will truly laugh himself to death if he hears about that." Chen Ping'an slowed down and said with a headache, "Then what should we do? Find somewhere nearby to hide? I actually wanted to leave the small town. There's a place that's not easy to find." Ningyao suddenly recalled something and she asked in curiosity, "Where's that wood and porcelain armor that you made by yourself? Why aren't you wearing it?" Chen Ping'an smiled bitterly and said, "It's not very useful against that old ape, and instead of helping, it will even slow me down. So I decided to take it off. Thankfully I did, or else I don't know how I would have carried you away. I wouldn't have been able to carry you on my shoulder or back, nor would I have been able to carry you in my arms. Just thinking about it is giving me a headache." Ningyao sighed before making up her mind and saying, "Chen Ping'an, put me down first. Then carry me on your back to that place you mentioned." Chen Ping'an naturally didn't have any objections. He put Ningyao down and shifted her onto his back without any hesitation before running off again. "Ningyao, where's your saber? Why do you only have your saber scabbard?" he asked. With her arms wrapped around Chun Pingin's neck, she huffed. "It's buried in the ground." Chun Pingin didn't ask any more questions as he ran to an unfrequented place outside the small town. This was a desolate area that was scattered with tombs that no one visited anymore. Weeds covered the tombs, and they grew so thick that this place looked more like a vegetable garden than a burial site. They could hear the hoots of owls from time to time, and this made the surroundings appear even creepier. Fortunately, Chun Pingin wasn't like the other children at his age, and he harbored a unique feeling toward this place. Thus, he didn't feel uncomfortable at all. After around 15 minutes, Chun Pingin navigated through countless broken and collapsed statues with Ningyao on his back, and he arrived behind the gigantic statue of a god that was collapsed and missing its head for some reason. Its body was 6 meters long, and one could imagine just how mighty and dignified it would have once appeared when it was unbroken and quietly sitting in a temple. Chun Pingin squatted down and attempted to let Ningyao climb off his back. However, there was surprisingly no response after waiting for a while, and Chun Pingin was almost scared to death, thinking that Ningyao had already died on the way here. As he stood there with a stupefied expression on his face, completely speechless with shock, the young girl who had enjoyed a nice and comfortable nap this entire time finally woke up, instinctively wiping the corners of her mouth with the back of her hand. She then asked in a sleepy voice, "Are we there?" For some reason, Chun Pingin almost burst into tears upon hearing her voice. He hurriedly took a deep breath and calmed himself down. He then gently released his grip on Ningyao's legs to let her down before turning around and saying with a smile, "This is a temporary hut that I built last autumn. I used to always bring Gukin here to play, and he would always nag me to build something fun for him. So I collected some branches and built a frame. Then I grabbed some leaves and grass to place on top of it. It's fairly sturdy, and it didn't collapse even after 2 bouts of heavy snow last winter." Ningyao stood up and looked back, and she didn't see the flying sword returning in a disheveled manner. This was a good sign, as it signified that the old ape hadn't found their hiding spot yet. Chun Pingin told Ningyao to wait for a moment as he bent down and entered the small hut. After tidying it up a little, he opened the door and invited her in. Ningyao felt a sense of relief as she sat in the hut that didn't feel too cramped. Chun Pingin didn't shut the crude wooden door, and he instead sat in the doorway with his back to Ningyao. "Why aren't you shutting the door?" Ningyao asked. "It won't make a difference if that old ape finds us." Chun Pingin shook his head and said. Sitting cross-legged, Ningyao nodded and said, "That's true." After falling silent for a moment, Ningyao continued, "You don't have any questions that you want to ask?" Sure enough, Chun Pingin asked, "Did the old ape use all 3 breaths of qi?" "MHM. However, I've got some bad news for you," Ningyao replied. "He can break the rules at least one more time, and that's more than enough to deal with us 2 injured people." "Ningyao, what price will he have to pay?" Chun Pingin asked. The fragrance of the nearby grass seeped into the small hut, causing the air to feel cool and refreshing. Even though it was slightly humid, Ningyao felt like this was already very good. She couldn't ask for too much. Shun thought carefully for a moment before replying, "The old ape has fought 3 times. The first time was when he chased you from Clay Vase Alley to the west side of the small town. He was more cautious at that time, and it was mainly because he was trying to gauge whether you had external support or not. After all, he was afraid that someone was trying to lure him into a trap and target his young mistress from Sunscorch Mountain. Thus, he probably only had 3 to 5 years shaved off his lifespan. The second time was when he fought against me by the creek. That probably shaved 20 or so years off his lifespan. The third time he fought us, he probably lost at least 50 years of his lifespan. The next time he fights us, he'll probably lose at least 100 years of his lifespan." There was a bright glimmer in Chun Pingin's eyes as he pulled a stalk of grass from the ground and flicked the dirt from its roots before placing it in his mouth. "Then we'll call it 180 years. That's already a huge win," he said with a beaming smile. "If I ignore what Kai Jinjian did to me and assume that I can live to 60 years old like most ordinary people, that's already a gain of 2 extra lives. Anyway, I feel like that old ape will become furious when he thinks about the fact that he sacrificed almost 200 years of his lifespan to deal with me." Ning Yao frowned and said, Chun Ping'an, you really feel like your life is that worthless? Compared to an immortal beast like that old ape who's lived for thousands of years, a peasant potter from a small town like me is naturally not worth anything, Chun Ping'an replied without hesitation. Admitting this isn't shameful. Ning Yao felt extremely stifled after hearing Chun Ping'an's foolish reasoning. Chun Ping'an turned around and said with a smile, of course, conceding this is one matter, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel wronged at all. Just think about it. We were all equally born into this world, so why should my life be worth nothing? Ning Yao was just about to answer his question and recite a few motivating sayings by the sages to show off her knowledge. Unexpectedly, however, Chun Ping'an quickly answered his own question. He sincerely said to himself, perhaps I didn't do enough good deeds in my previous life? But I haven't had enough time to do good deeds in this life either. Then aren't I screwed for my next life again? What should I do? Ning Yao picked up the empty green saber scabbard that was resting on her legs and used its tip to lightly prod Chun Ping'an on the back. Chun Ping'an grimaced, and he immediately turned around to look at her with an indignant expression. Ning Yao glared at him and said, You're nowhere near dying yet, so why are you already thinking about your next life? Chun Ping'an hurriedly raised a finger and gestured for her to be quiet. Ning Yao immediately shut up. Chun Ping'an shuffled forward a little, attempting to create some distance between himself and Ning Yao's saber scabbard. Ning Yao wanted to say something, but she didn't know whether she should. In the end, she decided to tell Chun Ping'an the truth, saying in a hoarse voice, Chun Ping'an, have you ever considered this? Even though he's lost 180 years from his lifespan, what was the initial lifespan of this mountain-moving ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain? Gazing at the sky with his back to the young girl, Chun Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. How could he know about such a mysterious thing? He probably couldn't guess correctly even if he racked his brains as hard as he could. Some things were just like the bluestone slabs in Fortune Street and Peach Leaf Alley. If Chun Ping'an hadn't run over there to deliver letters, he would have never known that there existed roads other than mud roads in the world. Ning Yao sighed and said, as descendants of ancient beasts born from the peculiar phenomenon of heaven and earth, the acupoints of these beasts are far inferior to those of us humans. As such, it's extremely difficult for them to cultivate. However, the good thing about this is that their vitality is eroded far slower than ours, and this allows them to enjoy extremely long lifespans. On the lower end, they can enjoy a lifespan of 500 years, while on the higher end, they can enjoy a lifespan of 5,000 years. Mountain-moving apes like to move around a lot, so if they don't cultivate, they naturally won't enjoy an excessively long lifespan. They naturally won't live for as long as tortoises and flood dragons. However, the mountain-moving apes used to be the dominant force in some region in the past, after all, so their lifespans can still reach up to 2,000 years. Moreover, this old ape has clearly mastered some mystical abilities already, so once he advances to the upper 5 tiers, combined with his 9th tier physique, it's possible that he can enjoy a lifespan of 3,000 years or even 4,000 years, to say nothing of just 2,000 years. Ning Yao looked at the slightly skinny boy in front of her and said, So don't feel like you've lived enough already. Chun Ping'an didn't say anything. Meanwhile, Ning Yao felt a little sad for him. The two of them fell silent. Ning Yao started to feel a little guilty for revealing this secret, and she tried to rack her brain for some words to comfort Chun Ping'an. However, when she started to develop a headache after thinking too hard, she suddenly heard the soft sound of snoring traveling over from in front of her. Ning Yao was stupefied. This was a large residence deep in Apricot Blossom Alley. It was clean and tidy from the outside to the inside, and even the path in front of the courtyard gate was cleaner than those of its neighbors. An old lady whose face could never be described as kindly and benevolent lifted the candle in her hands to make the room a little brighter. She then looked at her grandson with a doting expression, saying for the millionth time, Why did you run off to the rooftop so late at night again? As the saying goes, the chill of winter carries into spring. However, you never listened to me. You're still growing now, so what will you do if the chilly weather leaves you with an incurable illness? How will your grandma live then? The stupid young boy replied with a grin. The old woman sighed as she sat down, saying, Oh, my darling grandson, do you know? In the morning, that ungrateful brat suddenly came knocking for heaven knows what reason, with bags of big and small gifts in his hands. You weren't home at the time, so you weren't able to see his expression. Oh, he appeared like a dutiful son and caring father. Your grandma was almost moved to tears. The old woman wore an expression of ridicule as she said this, and she suddenly turned around to spit a ball of thick phlegm on the ground. However, she immediately regretted this, and she hurriedly used the tip of her foot to smush it away. Looking up and seeing her grandson's indifferent expression, she was suddenly filled with a sense of anger and irritation. Nonetheless, she couldn't bring herself to hit him, so she could only huff, "Oh, you heartless brat, you don't even know to care for your grandma. Your original name was Ma Xian, but since you were abandoned by your parents, is your life not a bitter and hard one?" So grandma added the character K to your name. If you feel like it's too unlucky, you can change it back in the future if you want. It's nothing major, so you don't need to care about what your grandma thinks. Grandma is nothing but an old lady from a small town, and I'm just like a naive toad in the fields. With such a lack of knowledge, it almost serves me right to have such a difficult life. The old woman started to wipe away her tears. Ma Kuxuan reached over and placed a hand on his grandma's dry and bony hand. A hint of emotion finally appeared in the old woman's eyes as she looked at her grandson, and a smile appeared on her face as she lifted her hand to pat the back of Ma Kuxuan's hand. Your grandma is quite an unfortunate person. Your grandpa was someone with a conscience, but he wasn't someone with skill. So he wasn't someone who could be relied on. Meanwhile, my son was someone with skill but not someone with a conscience. So he also wasn't someone who could be relied on. In the end, you're the only person who I still care about. If you don't make some progress soon, your grandma would have truly endured all these hardships for nothing. However, what are a few hardships? Just don't be like your grandma in the future. You definitely have to grow up and make a name for yourself in the future. If someone bullies you, then bully them back 1,000 times harder. You definitely shouldn't become a good person. In terms of being a bad person, it's okay if it's just for a few times. Just don't think about harming others all the time. One needs to be careful of facing punishment and retribution after all, right? The heavens might like to nod off for years on end, but there are ultimately the occasional moments when the heavens open its eyes. If you're unlucky enough to get caught, then ouch. Ma Kuxuan had been forced to listen to these ramblings from a very young age, and it was very likely that he had already grown calluses in his ears from listening to all this. In fact, he had probably already gone through several cycles of calluses. However, Ma Kuxuan ultimately didn't pull his hand away, and he allowed his grandma to lightly hold his hand. The old woman suddenly asked, "Why do you like that despicable Zhigue?" "Because she looks good," Ma Kuxuan replied with a faint smile. The old woman lightly slapped the back of Ma Kuxuan's hand and scolded, "You heartless little maggot! You won't even tell your grandma the truth." Ma Kuxuan smiled and said, "Don't worry, Grandma, it's a good thing." The old woman was skeptical, but she decided to drop this topic for the moment, saying, "Do you know why your parents abandoned you?" Ma Kuxuan smiled and replied, "Because we were poor back then? So they couldn't afford to raise me." The old woman suddenly raised her voice, screeching, "Poor? For the past 7 or 8 generations, the Ma clan genuinely hasn't been poor. However, we've become accustomed to bowing down to others, so much so that we don't even know how to act as masters anymore. In fact, our ancestors left an instruction for us. Regardless of how wealthy we become, we can never move our residence to Fortune Street or Peach Leaf Alley. If your wretched parents were poor, would they be able to wear gold and silver every day? Would they be able to enjoy delicacies every meal? Apart from not daring to move to Fortune Street and Peach Leaf Alley where the 4 surnames and 10 clans are gathered, what comfort haven't they enjoyed?" The old woman became angry every time she talked about her son and her daughter-in-law. She chuckled coldly and said, "Those ancestral teachings and instructions are merely things that have decayed in the mud with time. After all these years, what are they still worth? My dear grandson, just ignore them when you make a name for yourself in the future. Grandma has lived for all these years, and I've seen all kinds of wealthy people and poor people. At the end of the day, however, only talentless fools choose to be honest people." Ma Kuxuan wore a dazzling smile, and it was hard to say whether this was because he agreed with his grandma or because he thought her words were farcical. He had always been like this, and he had always been able to endure hardships and harassment from others. However, when he put his mind to something, he would become so stubborn that even his grandma couldn't persuade him otherwise. The old woman pondered for a moment before running over to see if the courtyard door was locked. She then returned inside and sat back down, saying in a quiet voice, Ma Kuxuan, don't think that your grandma has been acting strange all these years. Apart from being a midwife and offering charmed water to others, I've also shamelessly collected trash from others. However, everything that your grandma collected was an extremely valuable treasure. Ma Kuxuan wore an exhausted expression at this moment, and it was clear that he was completely uninterested in his grandma's large box of trinkets. However, the old woman continued to explain how she had tricked and swindled others in the past, her expression bright and filled with smugness. Ma Kuxuan suddenly asked, Grandma, did Chan Pingin's father die in? The old woman's expression changed drastically, and she hurriedly reached over to cover her grandson's mouth, saying with a stern expression, Some things can be done, but they can't be talked about. The young boy nodded with a smile, not asking any more questions on this topic. The old woman also lost interest in boasting about her past exploits, and she suddenly looked a little sick and listless at this moment. It was as if something were weighing on her mind, and she would glance out the window at the night sky from time to time. Ma Kuxuan smiled and said, Grandma, you've been the sorceress of our small town for so many years, and our neighbors in Apricot Blossom Alley all praise you and say that you can overcome the gap between yin and yang and bring ghosts back to the living world. The old woman rolled her eyes and said, You actually believe their nonsense? Your grandma is someone who's even afraid of thunder, so will I not be scared to death if I truly see a ghost? Don't be afraid, Grandma, Ma Kuxuan said with a smile. Humans and ghosts walk two different worlds, just as gods and immortals walk two different realms. On one side is the great Tao, and on the other side is heaven and earth. A new dawn arrived. Sitting inside the small hut, Ning Yao slowly opened her eyes. Chan Ping'an was nowhere to be seen. Ning Yao hurriedly stood up and bent down to exit the small hut. With a tap of her foot, she then sprang up onto the large shoulder of the collapsed and broken statue. Chan Ping'an was running over from the distance, with his footsteps neither hurried nor slow. It didn't look like he was fleeing from someone. When he saw the young girl in green, he hurriedly waved his hand and gestured for her to come down. Ning Yao jumped down from the statue and landed in front of Chan Ping'an. The old ape hasn't found our hiding place yet, Chan Ping'an said. After saying this, Chan Ping'an clasped his hands together and bowed at the headless statue of the god, murmuring something quietly. Ning Yao could vaguely make out what he was saying, and it was things like begging the god to not blame her for being disrespectful and so on. She rolled her eyes, but she didn't say anything. Afterward, Chan Ping'an lowered his voice and said with a mysterious expression, Let me show you two statues. They're extremely interesting. Is it some god or immortal who's willing to show themselves to you? Are you trying to tell me that your sincerity is going to reap instant results? Chan Ping'an huffed and said, Ning Yao, your words are seriously. Ning Yao raised an eyebrow. Chan Ping'an immediately changed tact, continuing in a smooth manner, like that of a well-read person. It was as if Ning Yao had suddenly become a different person at this moment. She coughed a few times and reminded herself to remain modest. Chan Ping'an led the way, and Ning Yao quietly followed after him. She unconsciously raised a finger and massaged her glabella. She had truly walked a tightrope between life and death. After a long mental battle with herself, she took a deep breath and weakly uttered two words, Thank you. Chan Ping'an had been keeping his eyes peeled and his ears open the entire time, so he naturally heard Ning Yao's sudden words of gratitude, even though in his mind he didn't feel like she needed to thank him. Instead, he was the one who should have thanked her. However, Chan Ping'an truly didn't know where to start, so he decided to ignore this matter altogether. Chan Ping'an suddenly stopped in his tracks. He looked toward the south in a daze and muttered, What if the old ape has already been kicked out of this small world by Mr. Qi? And that's the reason why he hasn't found us yet? What should we do then? Ning Yao didn't know what to say to this. Chan Ping'an continued to walk forward, not showing any signs of feeling unwell. Ning Yao quickened her pace and walked up beside him, asking, Chan Ping'an, are you okay? Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied, I'm fine. I know that some things are just like this and there's nothing we can do to change it. He hadn't gone to school before, so he naturally didn't know that phrase that completely captured his emotion at this moment. A limit there exists to everyone's ability. Ning Yao suddenly came to a stop. When Chan Ping'an turned around in puzzlement, she pointed at the red mark on her glabella and said, I know that you're curious but don't have the courage to ask. So let me tell you the truth. This is my trump card. Is the old ape from sun-scorched mountain powerful? He's bullied us to a very miserable state, right? However, inside the acupoint on my glabella is the birthday present that my mother gave me for my 11th birthday. It's my bonded treasure, and once I unleash it, not only will the old ape die, but... She suddenly paused at this moment, and she eventually decided to directly skip over it, continuing. I'm saying all this because I want to tell you something. The world is very big, so don't underestimate yourself and don't become discouraged. Aren't you already practicing martial arts now? Why don't you practice swordsmanship as well? You know how to teach sword techniques? Chen Ping'an asked. Ning Yao replied with perfect assurance. My talent is far too great, and I also started to practice sword techniques from a very young age. So, my skill level is also rising extremely quickly. In terms of teaching other sword techniques, however, I don't even know where to start. Chen Ping'an scratched his head. Ning Yao pondered for a moment before saying with a serious expression, even if I want to give my flying sword to you, the flying sword definitely won't agree. Moreover, I don't want to humiliate it like that either. In my hometown, we view swords with spirits as equals and like-minded beings. In the end, Ning Yao removed the snow-white sword scabbard from her waist and said, But I can give this sword scabbard to you. Chen Ping'an was baffled and he asked, Why? Ning Yao firmly patted Chen Ping'an's shoulder and said in a meaningful manner, Since you already have a sword scabbard, will you be far away from becoming a sword immortal? Chen Ping'an dazedly accepted the empty sword scabbard, his expression dumbfounded as he uttered, Say what? Ning Yao strode forward. She felt like she had just done something extremely natural and dashing. This was all there was to it. Chen Ping'an carefully held the sword scabbard, thinking to himself, Where in the world am I going to find a sword from? Chen Ping'an led Ning Yao to a 5-colored statue. This statue was around a head taller than a young man, and it had initially had 3 pairs of arms. Now, however, only the arm with its hand clenched into a fist and held high above its head remained, as well as the arm that was lowest and making a handshake gesture. The reason it could make this handshake gesture was because 2 hands of this statue had been interlocked before, so even though the other arm had already broken off, its hand was still able to remain. This 5-colored statue was that of an armored god with a large beard. His armor was impressive, with numerous scales interlocked in a flowing pattern. The perimeters of these scales were also decorated with 2 red threads as well as plump red beads. In terms of looks alone, the gulf between this suit of armor and Lu Xianyang's ugly suit of wart armor was like the gulf between Ji Gui and Granny Ma. The statue stood on top of a pitch-black stone platform, and compared to the headless statue that they had stayed under last night, this colorful statue appeared much more lively and spirited, even though it was missing several arms and had already become mottled in color. Most importantly, 2 of the statue's hands were interlocked in an extremely strange position near its waist. Ning Yao immediately noticed something, and she understood why Chen Ping'an had hurriedly brought her over here. She nodded and said, It does indeed look a bit like the standing meditation stance from the mountain shaking guide. However, it's a little bit different from the sword furnace stance from the guide. She pondered for a moment before asking, Can we find its other arms nearby? Chen Ping'an squatted down and shook his head in pity. I've tried to look for them before. However, I wasn't able to find anything. They're most likely been broken by the children trotting all over them when playing hide and seek here. After so many years, I feel like these statues of gods have already experienced all kinds of hardships and beatings. Just look at this one. There's a large chunk missing from his fist up there, and there are also many cracks on the side. It's clear that his fist has taken a beating from slingshots or stones thrown at him. The children in the small town are all like this. The more that their guardians prohibit them from coming here to play, the more that they enjoy sneaking here to catch crickets and dig up wild vegetables. This is especially the case when winter arrives and snow falls. Dozens of them will come here to have snow fights, and that's truly a scene that's as lively as can be. After playing to their heart's content, will they still have the effort to worry about anything else? The children also like to compete with each other, and they try to see who can climb to the top of these statues. There are even some children who like to take a leak after climbing on top of these statues' heads, and they'll compete to see who can pee the furthest. So just think about it. After so many years, how can there still be a complete and undamaged statue? In fact, there used to be a few wooden statues here when I was still little. However, I heard that there was someone who was too lazy to enter the mountains to collect firewood, so they eventually turned their attention to these statues. When winter arrived, he secretly snuck over and dragged the statues back to his house. He then chopped them up and used them as firewood. Chen Ping'an continued to rattle on, and there was a sense of dejection and sadness in his voice as he said, "Old Man Yao gave me the cold shoulder and said that I didn't have the aptitude for firing pottery at the time, so he shooed me off to the mountains to collect firewood. If I had known that there was someone like that in the small town, I would have definitely gone over to persuade him against his plans. If that didn't work, I could have even offered to collect firewood for him. Even though those statues of gods never give their blessings, they are still statues of gods and bodhisattvas after all. Yet, he chopped them up to use as firewood? How could someone do something so immoral?" Ning Yao and Chen Ping'an were focused on two starkly different matters at this moment. With one hand pinching her chin and one hand resting under her elbow, there was a glimmer in Ning Yao's eyes as she said, "If my guess isn't wrong, the sword furnace from your mountain shaking guide is derived from this statue's stance. However, it's not derived from the pair of hands that you can see right now. Instead, it was derived from the middle two arms of this statue of a Taoist enforcer. It was those two arms that formed the stance of the sword furnace. However, I'm not sure why the author of the fist guide only chose one pair of arms to use as inspiration, ignoring the two hands that we can still see now. In any case, I can say with certainty that the sword furnace, or the enforcer sword finger hand seal, is divided into two levels, big and small." Chen Ping'an didn't understand a single word that she was saying. However, he didn't forget to retort her and say, "This fist guide is Gu Kan's. I'm only looking after it for him right now." Ning Yao didn't argue with Chen Ping'an. Instead, she pointed at the Taoist enforcer statue and said, "Do you see? In the fist guide, it's the pinky on the right hand that's sticking out. Here, however, 9 of his fingers are intertwined and locked together, with only the index finger of the left hand sticking out by itself. This is in order to form and nurture a sword finger." Ning Yao continued to speak by herself, saying, "I've traveled your world for many years, and I've been able to see the 4 heavenly kings of many different temples and abbeys. This statue..." Chen Ping'an waited for her to continue, yet he still didn't hear anything after waiting for a long time. In the end, he could only open his mouth and say, "Is there something strange about it?" Ning Yao nodded and said with a serious expression, It's the shortest." Chen Ping'an, who was squatting on the ground, didn't say anything. He simply raised a thumb at her. Ning Yao turned around and asked, "Have you seen any statues of Tao enforcers that are even taller than Cloud Drape Mountain over here?" "Of course not," Chen Ping'an replied. However, he faltered for a moment before asking in puzzlement, "Cloud Drape Mountain over here?" Ning Yao came to a sudden realization and she explained, "It's the tallest mountain in this place. It's said that a very long time ago, an enlightened person buried a heavenly master seal under Cloud Drape Mountain, using it to suppress the dragon Qi in this small world." Chen Ping'an's eyes lit up and he said, "Do you know its approximate location? Can we dig it up?" Ning Yao smiled with squinted eyes and said, "What, you want to dig it up and sell it?" Chen Ping'an blushed slightly after being exposed, and he replied honestly, "Not necessarily sell it. When it comes to valuable items, even keeping them and passing them down as family heirlooms will be fairly nice." Ning Yao made a tapping motion at the young boy who had become engrossed in material wealth, and she scoffed, "If you found a sect in the future, your avaricious and miserly nature will definitely ensure that everyone in your sect has enough to eat and drink and wear for the rest of their lives. They can just lie down and enjoy life." Chen Ping'an wasn't thinking that far ahead. As for founding a sect or whatnot, he more so didn't understand what Ning Yao was saying. He stood up and asked, "Regardless of whether it's big or small, is the remaining stance of this statue also a type of sword furnace?" Ning Yao nodded and replied, "The big sword furnace and the small sword furnace are categorized by the left or right hand. However, what's being nurtured most certainly isn't the index finger of the left hand or the pinky finger of the right hand. Instead, we need to draw a trace up all the way until..." Ning Yao closed her eyes and focused her attention at this moment. In fact, she could sense these locations even if she didn't form a hand seal and enter the standing meditation stance. She opened her eyes and curled her fingers, pointing to two locations on the back of her head, the Jade Pillow Acupoint and the Celestial Pillar Acupoint. These acupoints were indeed suitable locations for nurturing one's bonded flying sword. Ningyao smiled and said, "The sword furnace of the left hand corresponds to here, and the sword furnace of the right hand points to here." Chun Ping'an was baffled and he said, "Ningyao, I've always wanted to ask you something. You say that the sword furnace relates to the standing meditation of the fist technique, but how does twisting my fingers around relate to practicing a fist technique? Can it increase my strength?" Ningyao was stupefied. It was truly far too difficult for her to explain martial arts in fine detail. After all, she had easily overcome all of the obstacles that she had faced. Did these boring principles really need to be explained? Were they not naturally learned and easily understandable? Thus, Ningyao wore a stern expression and said, "If you haven't reached a suitable tier yet, telling you about this will be a waste of my breath. Just put your head down and work harder." "What? It's too tiring and challenging for you?" Chun Ping'an was slightly skeptical and he carefully asked, "Ningyao, is it truly like this?" Ningyao crossed her arms before her chest, her expression proper and righteous as she said, "What else could it be like?" Chun Ping'an didn't continue to pester her about this topic. He looked up at the colorful statue that Ningyao referred to as the Taoist enforcer, and he said, "So, this is an immortal from the same teaching as Taoist Lu." Ningyao was slightly exasperated and she said, "What do you mean from the same teaching as Taoist Lu? First of all, even though it's called the Taoist teaching, this teaching definitely doesn't mean the same thing as family. The breadth of the Taoist teaching far exceeds your imagination. In fact, even I'm not sure about how many different branches and schools the Taoist teaching has. I've only heard my father mention that there are 4 different ancestral temples with one above, one below, one in the south, and one in the north. Forget about it. Telling you about this is like trying to play the lute to a cow. Second of all, gods and immortals are not the same thing. Even though everyone likes to mention them together, in fact all the mortals like to do this as well, they are ultimately not the same thing. Gods and immortals walk completely different paths. Let me give you an example. Have you heard of the saying humans fight for qi, while gods fight for incense before? Chun Ping'an nodded and said, Apricot Blossom Ellie's Granny Ma and Gu Kan's mother always threw this phrase around when they argued with each other. Feeling like she was a commander teaching her subordinate, Ningyao elaborated, "Why do gods fight for incense? This is because they do indeed need incense to survive. Without incense, gods will gradually decline in power and ultimately lose their profound abilities. This is analogous to how people need to eat. If someone doesn't eat for several days, will they still have any energy left? Why do mortal empires order local officials to prohibit and shut down illegal temples? It's because they're afraid of people offering incense to the wrong deities, allowing those who don't deserve godhood to reach godhood. Taking a step back, even if these illegitimate gods are good-natured ones who are willing to protect local residents and never break any rules, mortal emperors don't see things the same way as us. They view themselves as true dragons, and they view these illegitimate temples and gods as forces that are bringing chaos to a corner of their territory. In other words, these are forces that are invading their territory and reducing their power and fortune. As a result, an emperor's time on the throne will also be reduced. With this in mind, how can mortal emperors allow them to exist? As for immortals, this is very simple. The large majority of outsiders that you see are immortals. In fact, even the old ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain can be regarded as half an immortal. They've all arrived on this path of great Tao using their own abilities, and they're all trying to climb this mountain to reach a state of immortality that rests at the summit. Cultivators are also referred to as qi refiners, and cultivation is also referred to as a process of cultivating immortality or cultivating truth. Then is this Taoist enforcer a god or an immortal? According to your explanation, he should be regarded as an immortal from the Taoist teaching, right? Chun Ping'an asked. Ningyao wore a solemn expression as she lightly shook her head. She didn't delve any deeper into these secrets. She suddenly furrowed her brows. A small stone mysteriously shot over, forcefully smashing into the raised fist of the Taoist enforcer and causing several clay shards to rain down. Ningyao waved her hands and pushed the clay pieces away. Chun Ping'an stood up and followed Ningyao's gaze. Turning around, he saw an unexpected figure. This was a short and tanned young boy. He was squatting on a distant statue, and he was tossing a stone in one of his hands. Chen Ping'an stood up beside Ning Yao, and he said in a soft voice, "He's called Ma Kuxuan, and he's Granny Ma's grandson. He's a very strange person, and he's never liked to talk from a very young age. The last time I saw him by the creek, he even came up to me and actively spoke to me." It was clear that he already knew the value of the snake gall pebbles. Ma Kuxuan stood up and continued to toss the stone in his hand. He flashed a brilliant smile at Ning Yao and Chen Ping'an, and he said, "If I go to the Li clan's residence in Fortune Street and tell that old ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain that I found you too, I reckon that I'll be able to earn a pouch of copper coins no matter what. However, I can pretend that I didn't see anything if you two are willing to offer me 2 bags of copper coins. Let me say this first though. This is merely a transaction, so don't have any thoughts about trying to kill me. There are so many gods and bodhisattvas observing us, so be careful of getting bad karma." Ning Yao was quite angry, and she was just about to speak. However, Chen Ping'an pulled her back and stepped forward, saying to Ma Kuxuan in a solemn voice, "Will you really uphold your end of the deal if I give you 2 pouches of copper coins?" Ma Kuxuan faltered slightly, and it was as if he hadn't imagined that Chen Ping'an and Ning Yao would be so open to negotiation. To his surprise, they were genuinely trying to make a deal with him. However, he couldn't be bothered acting anymore, and he retrieved an exquisite money pouch from his pocket before casually tossing it to the ground. He smiled and said, "I've already received payment from the Li clan. However, I didn't do this for the sake of money. Chen Ping'an from Clay Vase Alley, Song Jisen's neighbor, correct? If you want to blame someone, then blame the girl next to you for being too detestable. She ruined a lot of people's plans and grand schemes yesterday." Ma Kuxuan pursed his lips and pointed at himself, saying, "For example, mine." Chen Ping'an scanned the surroundings. Ma Kuxuan looked at Ning Yao and said with a smile, "Don't worry, that old ape has something to deal with right now. Taking this opportunity, I wanted to ask you for something. You already know what it is, am I right?" Ning Yao chuckled coldly and said, "Be careful that you won't live long enough to use it." Ma Kuxuan smiled and said, "You're not my wife or anything, so there's no need for you to worry about this." Chen Ping'an truly couldn't imagine why other people viewed this eerie and sinister person as a mentally challenged retard. Ning Yao wore a dark expression, and she bumped Chen Ping'an's shoulder before saying in a soft voice, "After arriving near here, my flying sword isn't able to enter for some reason." Ma Kuxuan shifted his gaze slightly, cracking a grin at Chen Ping'an and saying, "Your battle on the rooftops yesterday was enthralling. I managed to witness it by coincidence. Oh, that's right, you can remove the pouches of sand on your legs now. Otherwise, you won't be able to catch up to me." Sure enough, Chen Ping'an squatted down and slowly rolled up his pants legs. However, his eyes remained locked on Ma Kuxuan the entire time. Only at this moment did Ning Yao surprisingly discover a pouch of sand wrapped around each of Chen Ping'an's calves. Chen Ping'an explained to her, "When I was little, Grandpa Yang from the Yang family's medicine shop told me to never remove these pouches of sand. I initially planned to remove them to deal with the old ape's 4th breath of qi. However, I feel like now is a fairly suitable time to remove them as well. It's also because I have a nagging feeling that Ma Kuxuan is just as dangerous as that old ape." Ma Kuxuan deftly jumped down from the statue, and he took a glance at the young girl in green before muttering to himself, "I thought I would only come across my first Dao enemy after leaving the small town. Who knew I would meet one so quickly? Haha, I truly can't stop my good fortune." Ning Yao suddenly asked, "Chen Ping'an, was he also whipped in the face by cowtails when he was little?" Chen Ping'an stood up and lightly stomped his feet several times. After carefully thinking over Ning Yao's question, he replied, "Granny Ma's very rich, so in my memory, the cows that they owned were all especially large. It was truly terrifying when they started to swing their tails around." When Chen Ping'an stood up, Ma Kuxuan squatted down again, scooping up a handful of stones in his left hand. In the end, the young boy from Clay Vase Alley and the young boy from Apricot Blossom Alley faced each other from afar. Chen Ping'an imperceptibly dug the tips of his feet into the ground, and it was as if he were familiarizing himself with his legs that had become lighter. He was observing Ma Kuxuan the entire time, and he noticed that Ma Kuxuan had picked up 5 stones, with 4 in his left hand and 1 in his right. Ma Kuxuan appeared calm and composed as he looked at the young girl from the outside world whose sword and saber scabbards were both empty at this moment. He smiled and said, Let me get this straight first. This is a battle between me and Chan Ping'an, and based on the stories that my grandma used to tell me when I was little, generals shouldn't call their underlings for help when they're dueling one-on-one. Whoever calls for reinforcements is a coward. If a general can slay their foe, then they'll greatly increase the morale of their side, and they would have essentially won the battle. Ning Yao couldn't help but feel annoyed as she looked at Ma Kuxuan. She had never seen such a punchable person before. Even though Clay Vase Ali's Song Jisun was also scheming and liked to show off his knowledge, he at least looked like a young scholar. Meanwhile, the young boy in front of them was skinny and short, and his skin was also tanned and no lighter than Chan Ping'an's. His eyes were also especially large, and this made him look extremely strange and uncanny. Add to that his strange logic and reasoning, and he seemed much like an old woman who had poured half a pound of makeup onto their face and was purposely trying to act bashful and seductive. This was truly a terrifying sight. Chan Ping'an didn't utter any threats to Ma Kuxuan, and he simply bent down slightly before suddenly exploding forward, with his speed as quick as a galloping horse as he charged at the young boy from Apricot Blossom Alley. So fast. Ning Yao gazed at Chan Ping'an's sprinting figure. In just the blink of an eye, he had already shot out more than 6 meters. She had seen and experienced many things before, but Ning Yao still couldn't help but exclaim in emotion. This naturally wasn't to say that Chan Ping'an was peerless among those at his age simply because he could sprint faster than foxes and rabbits. Instead, she admired him because he was able to work hard for a dozen or so years to temper his physique to such a level in this small world that was akin to a prison. Ning Yao pondered over this. Was being able to endure hardships also a talent? The distance between Chan Ping'an and Ma Kuxuan was quickly halved. In fact, Chan Ping'an could already see the slight changes in Ma Kuxuan's expression. There was a brief moment of astonishment, followed by a brief moment of fear, which rapidly disappeared and was replaced by an expression of calm and composure. Ma Kuxuan then quickly raised an arm without any hesitation, with his thin limb unleashing an astonishing burst of explosive power. Chan Ping'an had been staring at Ma Kuxuan's right hand the entire time, and he decided not to continue in a straight line anymore, instead leaning toward the right. Ma Kuxuan's elbow surprisingly paused for a moment, and with a flick of his wrist, a stone shot toward the turning Chan Ping'an. The stone possessed a ferocious might, and even though it wasn't as terrifying as the old ape's attacks, it was still something that Chan Ping'an needed to treat with caution. He should have been affected by the attack, but Chan Ping'an didn't grind to a halt. With a twist of his hips, his upper body leaned to the side, causing the stone to flash past his eyes. The strands of hair on his forehead were blown up by the gust of wind created by the stone. Ma Kuxuan flicked his left hand where he held the remaining stones, tossing one of them into his right hand. It seemed like he also knew that he couldn't dispose of Chan Ping'an with this second attack, so he decided not to remain in the same spot. He stood up and ran to his right, throwing the stone at Chan Ping'an at the same time. Chan Ping'an suddenly leaned down, with his hands almost able to touch the ground. The stone shot over his back, ripping his thin shirt. Fortunately, this was only a graze. Even though the wound looked bloody and frightening, it actually wasn't very deep. The distance between them halved again. At this moment, Ma Kuxuan also realized that he should retreat and increase the distance between them. However, Chan Ping'an was far too quick, so much so that Ma Kuxuan's hurried retreat appeared slow and clumsy in comparison. As Chan Ping'an drew closer, his resolute and clear gaze also became increasingly piercing. In contrast, a hint of hesitation flashed across Ma Kuxuan's eyes. Should he abandon this opportunity to attack and retreat instead? Or should he gamble everything on this third attack and have it determine the outcome of the fight? There was a clear juxtaposition between Ma Kuxuan's hesitation and Chan Ping'an's resoluteness. At this moment, did Chan Ping'an still look like a foolishly kind young boy from Clay Vase Alley? In this moment of life and death, Ma Kuxuan took a step back and swung his arm. It was clear that he believed in his own abilities. To say nothing of fighting with others, this reclusive young boy had never even argued with others before. Ever since he was little, he had never liked to hang out with others at his age, for example, Chan Ping'an and Gu Kan. He appeared more like a wild cat who liked to run around by himself. When he became bored, he liked to grab a handful of stones and throw them as he walked. Of course, he would throw them very lightly, and it would look like he was simply playing. Thus no one took this seriously. However, when Ma Kuxuan was alone on the banks under the covered bridge, he would skip stones across the surface of the water using slightly flatter stones. He could often have them skip more than a dozen times and strike the bottom surface of the stone arch bridge on the opposite bank, causing them to shatter. This was a clear indication of the dexterity of his hands and the power of his arms. Ma Kuxuan would often squat on top of the Azure Cow Ridge as well, using stones to strike the fish in the water. Regardless of whether these stones hit their target or not, they would almost never cause a splash. As a result, there would often be the mangled corpses of several birds lying on the roof or in the courtyard of that residence in Apricot Blossom Alley. There were only a dozen or so meters left between Chen Ping'an and Ma Kuxuan. When dodging Ma Kuxuan's two attacks just then, Chen Ping'an's movements could be described as more on the side of agile and light. He hadn't revealed any powerful muscles or limbs, and he was instead like a flittering leaf. However, when Chen Ping'an and Ma Kuxuan were about to collide, Chen Ping'an finally revealed his powerful side. He took 3 large strides that were both aggressive and powerful, with his feet appearing like hammers striking iron billets when they landed, and appearing like claws that could lift mountains when they rose. After these 3 large strides, the 2 young boys were almost face to face. Ma Kuxuan didn't have enough time to throw another stone. Logically speaking, he had already lost his best opportunity. However, Chen Ping'an's heart suddenly jolted at this moment, though he still didn't choose to retreat. This was because his momentum was far too great, making it impossible for him to come to a sudden stop. Since this was the case, he was better off leaping forward and taking a gamble. The corners of Ma Kuxuan's mouth curled up into a smile as he unclenched his left hand and discarded the remaining stones. His right hand was already clenched into a fist, so he immediately stepped forward and threw a punch. He had been laying a trap for Chen Ping'an since the very beginning. His hesitation, his allowing Chen Ping'an to draw closer, and even his choice to attack Chen Ping'an with stones, all of these were part of Ma Kuxuan's meticulous plan. He was purposely appearing weak to his enemy, and his aim was to draw the slimy boy who could escape from the old ape to his side. He was luring Chen Ping'an over on purpose. A distance of 1 arm was a distance of 1 punch. Chen Ping'an was left-handed, though this wasn't especially evident. Thus, his left fist forcefully collided together with Ma Kuxuan's right fist. As their fists collided, both of them raised their legs and kicked each other at almost the exact same moment. Chen Ping'an and Ma Kuxuan both flew back before heavily thumping to the ground. The distance between them grew to 20 or so meters again. Ma Kuxuan picked himself up, kneeling on one knee as he sucked in deep breaths. He raised his arm and unclenched his right fist. This was because he hadn't thrown that final stone. Thus, even though his palm couldn't be described as bloody and mangled, the wound on it was still sanguine red and frightening. Ma Kuxuan grimaced as he rubbed his stomach. There was fervor in his eyes, and he roared with laughter as he said, "Chen Ping'an, dare to exchange another blow." Chen Ping'an's left hand was in an even more miserable state. This was because a deep gash had been left on his palm by that shard of porcelain when he had killed Kai Jinjian in the small alley. Even though he applied the secret herbal ointment from the Yang family's medicine shop every day, such severe wounds usually needed around 100 days to fully heal. Regardless of how tough Chen Ping'an's physique was, he wasn't a powerful god or immortal after all. Thus, he had definitely suffered more during the exchange with Ma Kuxuan. Wrapped in cotton strips, Chen Ping'an's left hand was already involuntarily shaking. Blood seeped through the cotton strips and dripped onto the wild grass beside his feet. Chen Ping'an forced himself to take a deep breath, and this made him clearly feel the piercing pain traveling over from his abdomen. He needed to determine how much this pain would affect him in the coming exchanges. He was doing this out of habit. Chen Ping'an was born into an impoverished family, and it was exactly because he had far too few possessions that he was always so stingy about everything. In contrast, those born into rich families like Song Jisen and Lu Zhengchen would never care about how many copper coins they had in their pockets. They cared about the bigger picture, so they cared less about these trivial matters. However, Chen Ping'an naturally couldn't do this. Thus, the impression that Chen Ping'an gave others was that he was an extremely cautious person who was slightly indecisive but also very good at enduring things. Meanwhile, he didn't appear very lively and ambitious like the other youths. As for Ma Kuxuan, who had mysteriously run over to fight with him, he could most likely be regarded as a strange and eccentric person who was also very unreasonable. Ning Yao could still be described as sharp and unyielding at least, but Ma Kuxuan was someone who would leave others scratching their heads. Chen Ping'an didn't turn around, and he waved a hand at Ning Yao with his back facing her, signifying that he was okay. Ma Kuxuan slowly stood up, grabbing a handful of weeds as he did so. He then casually wiped away the blood on his palm. Chen Ping'an also stood up. Ma Kuxuan dashed forward first, with his explosive power so great that he left 2 pits where he had stood just then. Ma Kuxuan, who looked like a skinny monkey, was unfathomably quick as he dashed forward and leaped into the air, with his knee slamming down at Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an slammed his fist into Ma Kuxuan's flying knee. However, the lunging Ma Kuxuan also leaned forward and threw a lightning-quick jab, striking Chen Ping'an on the forehead. At the same time, his bent knees instantly straightened and smashed into Chen Ping'an's chest. It was as if Chen Ping'an had suffered a hammer strike to his head and a sledgehammer to his chest, causing him to involuntarily fall backward. Ma Kuxuan tumbled in the air before landing on his feet and continuing to dash forward with a wicked smile. He arrived before the half-squatting Chen Ping'an in no time, and he immediately launched another kick. Chen Ping'an raised his arms to block, with his left arm on the outside and his right arm on the inside. He stubbornly protected his face and chest. Chen Ping'an was sent flying by Ma Kuxuan's kick. However, his center of gravity had been extremely low, and he had also protected his weak points, so the outcome wasn't a bloody and miserable one. He continued to tumble along the ground. Ma Kuxuan didn't relent, and he continued to charge forward. When Chen Ping'an finally stopped rolling, he landed in a half-kneeling position with his knees bent and his body leaning forward, preparing him for a forward thrust. It was hard to say whether this was on purpose. Ma Kuxuan's expression faltered. In the next moment, Chen Ping'an shot forward like an arrow released at full draw, instantly arriving before Ma Kuxuan. His speed was so quick that he seemed like a completely different person compared to just then. Appearing weak to the enemy, Chen Ping'an also knew how to do this. Ma Kuxuan didn't even have the time to throw a punch as Chen Ping'an thrust his shoulder into his chest. Ma Kuxuan stumbled back, with another bout of agonizing pain traveling over from his stomach. He instinctively bent over, yet his left temple was immediately struck by Chen Ping'an's swinging forearm, the force of the strike so great that he was sent flying in a peculiar manner, with his feet trailing behind his body as he flew sideways. However, Chen Ping'an suddenly grabbed Ma Kuxuan's feet before swinging him around in a full circle. With a furious roar, he then viciously threw the 90-pound young boy into the distance. Ma Kuxuan flew toward the statue of a sitting god that was collapsed on one side. This statue was around 5 meters tall, and if things continued on the same trajectory, then Ma Kuxuan would definitely suffer a very gruesome fate. However, Ma Kuxuan didn't rely on any external help, as he created a surprise for himself. His feet landed on the head on the statue one before another, and he instantly bent his knees to absorb the impact before immediately straightening them again, causing him to shoot forward thanks to the huge rebounding momentum. He dashed toward his opponent in the distance. This was extremely similar to what Chen Ping'an had done just then. However, Ma Kuxuan's eyes suddenly widened in shock and terror. What greeted him was the sight of Chen Ping'an standing there, with one arm raised and holding a short dagger that had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. The tip of the blade was directly pointing at the fast-arriving Ma Kuxuan. When people uttered the words seeking death, this was probably the kind of situation they were talking about, no? Even though Chen Ping'an's arm was shaking violently, the way he held his dagger would still ensure that Ma Kuxuan's body was cleanly run through. The only difference would be whether the blade entered through his arm, head, or chest. Ma Kuxuan was facing a perilous situation, and he was gripped with a sense of extreme shock and fear. However, he didn't have any intention of giving up. He twisted his body with great difficulty, determined to protect his vitals from the fast-approaching blade. Right at this moment, a tall figure appeared between Chen Ping'an and Ma Kuxuan. This was a middle-aged man with a sword strapped to his back and a tiger talisman tied to his waist. Chen Ping'an wasn't able to see what he did, but in a flash, Ma Kuxuan rotated in the air and landed on his feet, with his body fully upright as he stood beside the man. The man turned around to look at Chen Ping'an, who had taken a step back with the dagger still in his hand. There was unconcealed approval and appreciation in his eyes as he chuckled softly and said, "You both did quite well." Blood seeped from the corners of Chen Ping'an's mouth, and he took another step back. The man smiled when he saw this, and he said in suggestion, "Since I stepped in to save Ma Kuxuan, I'll repay you by doing you a favor. After I leave, I'll convince the mountain-moving ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain to abandon his pursuit of you too. How does that sound?" Ning Yao walked up beside Chen Ping'an. The martial artist from True Martial Mountain took a deep look at Ning Yao. He then turned to Chen Ping'an and said, "You don't have the right to bargain with me. Nod if you agree, and continue to remain silent if you disagree. If you feel like this is unfair, or if you feel wronged, or if you feel like you can get lucky and escape from the old ape, then you can come and look for me at True Martial Mountain in the future. You can ask for what you think is fair." Chen Ping'an put away the skirt dagger that Ning Yao had lent him, hiding it in his right sleeve. He then nodded at the man and said, "If I have the opportunity, I'll definitely go and look for you." Ma Kuxuan was just about to speak, yet the man immediately cut him off with a cold expression, saying, "Dead people don't have the right to threaten living people." Ma Kuxuan tightly pursed his lips. However, he really did lower his head and remain silent. The master and disciple from True Martial Mountain slowly disappeared into the distance. Chen Ping'an plunked down on the ground. Ning Yao hurriedly bent down and asked in concern, "How are you feeling? Where are you hurt the most? Will the prescription from Taoist Lu still be useful?" With his face battered and bruised and his body filled with internal injuries, Chen Ping'an wore a bitter expression as he replied, "It should be fine. At the very least, I can still tell what area hurts, which means that my wounds aren't too severe. Oh, that's right. If the old ape comes over at this moment, then we'll let him come over." Ning Yao also decided to sit down, a smile on her face as she said, "You were here to fight for us just then, so I'll also be here to fight for us at that time. What's there to be afraid of?" Chen Ping'an silently swallowed the second half of the sentence that he hadn't spoken yet. Ning Yao's smile suddenly became dazzling, and she raised two thumbs at Chen Ping'an and said, "That was very impressive." At this moment, the impoverished young boy who had never viewed himself as impressive before forcefully tried to contain his smile. He purposely tried to make himself appear more nonchalant and carefree. In reality, however, nothing could wipe the happiness from his face. The young boy felt extremely proud as he sat in the spring breeze.